Hey, good morning, guys. How you doing? My name is Michael McCormick. I'm Director of Advanced Criminology in Owings Mills, Maryland. You guys been following me in reference to some of the production work we've been doing and investigative work we've been doing as it pertains to the Baltimore Police Department, dealing with Freddie Gray case, dealing with racketeering and corruption. So I've talked about those things, and we'll probably continue to do more videos about some of the detailed things that we know about, some of the things that need to be explained through someone is experienced in dealing with how to sift through some of the obfuscation that the police department reports to the general public. Same thing with the state attorney's office as well, just to get to the point. What I decided to do today was to kind of deviate from what I've talked about, but I'm going to come back to some of the things I've talked about in the past. But today I'm going to focus my attention on what they call direct and collateral consequences of legal arrest, detention, and conviction, as it pertains to all types of criminal stuff. And let me give you a definition, okay, because that's where we need to start in this case. We'll start with what the definition is of a collateral consequences, okay? Says here, give me a sec. Says here that collateral consequences of criminal prosecutions are unseen and often devastating, bedeviling efforts at appropriate sentencing and competent counseling. Unlike the explicitly articulated direct consequences of criminal convictions, such as prison terms, parole eligibility, fines, or collateral consequences, lay largely hidden and unspoken about. Collateral consequences, let's get into this, are in large part difficult to address because they exploit specialization that has become a hallmark of the legal profession. The consequences occur across a staggering array of substantive legal fields, confounding the ability of criminal jurists, practitioners, and the public they serve to appreciate fully all relevant repercussions. It's kind of the legal stuff I've been giving you here, but just know that collateral consequences of criminal prosecutions are unseen and often devastating, meaning that if a person is illegally arrested or legally arrested, they are direct and collateral issues that can happen because of those arrests and because of those convictions. So what we decided to do was to look at some of as these things pertain to what's going on in the Baltimore City Police Department. Baltimore City Police Department is not isolated in terms of corruption, in terms of misconduct that have affected thousands and thousands of their citizens. Just recently, when I say recently, in 2013, we had a crime lab technician who worked in Boston, and she faked drug evidence. She was a chemist. And in her actions, she had tainted more than 40,000, listen to this, 40,000 drug samples involving thousands of defendants. Innocent people were incarcerated, of course. Guilty persons have been released to further endanger the public. Millions and millions of public dollars are expended to deal with the chaos. All told, it has been determined in this particular chemist's case up in Boston that the cases may be as many as 40,000 people who may have had their cases tainted by her 9-year tenure as a chemist in the Boston crime lab. So far, and this report I have is a couple years ago, so I need to update it. But back then, a couple years ago, 300 people have been released. So the idea that you have misconduct within the criminal justice system, because crime lab technicians fall within that purview, the idea that you have people who are still doing committing misconduct issues, not only with the Baltimore City Police Department, but you have it as well in other departments within the police department. A lot of that, if not, I would say 90-some% of it, certainly deals with oversight. But one of the problems is that you have different levels of oversight. So in the case of, I'll give you an example, in the case of the gun squad in Baltimore City, you had supervisors who were sergeants. Okay, so they're, first line sergeants who are direct supervisors of the officers below them. And yet the problem still persisted with the misconduct that went on. So we have to go to the next level, which would be lieutenants and captains in these units. So it appears that even if you have direct supervision with sergeants in most of these units, it still becomes a problem. And so we're going to have to, in the future, we're going to have to start looking for lieutenants and captains to be held more accountable to the things that are going on in the field with the officers. It's just that simple. Even with the crime lab up in Boston, they're going to have outside agency or higher ups within that crime lab to start looking at their chemists and going behind these chemists and really checking what they're doing, because it should never get to the point that it's gotten to, where you have thousands of lives that have been affected. And at the same time, it's a huge public safety issue. Even if the officers in, let's say, Baltimore City made bad decisions by becoming criminals, essentially, there's no way in the world that all of their cases were probably bad. But because the state's attorney's office doesn't want to take the chance to sift through each and every case, they just blanket all the cases that this particular gun unit had are bad cases, and therefore those people are going to be released. But one of the issues is that if you release people, whether the cases were tainted or not, some of those cases are going to fall through the cracks, and you're going to have some people back on the street committing more crime and causing havoc in the streets of the city. Same as in Boston, with all of those affecting some 40,000 people within the criminal justice system. You're going to have some people, by virtue of the fact, will be let go, that cases probably needed more scrutiny, but still were let go, but yet they're back on the street to commit further crime. So it hampers the crime fighting effort of those police officers who are doing a good job, and those crime lab technicians who are doing a good job. It hampers their efforts, and certainly it now makes these departments look bad, and what it does is it creates a huge public relations issue as it pertains to the taxpayers who pay salaries of these folks. So the reason I talk so much about the first part is because we often don't look at what happens when bad actions of officers, of crime lab technicians take place, and who suffers. So that's what I decided to do when we talked today about direct consequences and collateral consequences of illegal arrest, detentions, convictions. And I'm going to focus strictly today, not on the crime lab issue up in Boston, but strictly today on the 8 officers who were assigned to the gun task force of Baltimore City. Now I'm going to go down a list of things that will happen to a person once they're in the criminal justice system by means of an illegal arrest, legal detention, or conviction. Now that conviction can be based on ill-gotten methods, which in this case with the gun task force, it was proven that everything that they did was against the law. But yet they got convictions in Baltimore City Circuit Court. So here we go. These are the things that can happen to you. Number one, your property can be confiscated. 2, your car can be towed away. 3, you'll have to pay a bail bondsman. 4, you'll have to retain counsel, whether it's public or private. 5, it's possible to lose a day or more of pay from a job. 6, there's reputation issues. 7, you have a record that has to be expunged when the state feels as though it can be expunged. 8, you'll sit in jail until bail. 9, in all likelihood, you'll receive excessive bail in most cases. Baltimore City Circuit Court or the Baltimore State Attorney's Office is notorious for giving high bails on African American men in the city for very little of doing nothing. I'm gonna forget the numbers just for a second. I'll go on to the next one. Might be you might lose a job while you're waiting, particularly when pretrial interviews you. A lot of people don't know when pretrial release comes to interview a person to determine whether or not they are eligible or can be eligible for bail, because that has to be done prior to you going to a bail review. What will happen is that pretrial release will ask you where do you work, and you'll say where you work. They will actually call your job. Now, if you're a person on a job, if you've never been in trouble before, and you've been there a couple years working, you've pretty much putting food on your table for your family, and pretrial release calls your job and your employer and asks, can you tell us about Michael? He's been charged with such and such. We want to know whether or not he's still working there, whatever. Well, that would, to me as an employee, I would say, whoa, what's going on here? I need to have more information. What was he locked up for? And so these are the things that can automatically, and this is, you haven't even gone to trial yet in this case. But these things can happen, and they have happened. The things I'm going to tell you, everything I tell you in this video today has to deal with things that happen every single day, all day, within every single jurisdiction within the United States, particularly as it pertains to African American men. Now, we'll move on. You have to pay now. Once your car got towed, you got to get it out of the towing company, which costs money. You'll also have to pay tickets. If it was a car stop and related to a traffic violation, perhaps, you'll have to pay your tickets, and that's another court date, because now that court date is a moving violation, and it's a must-appear type ticket. You'll have to go to traffic court, which is separate from the criminal court charge that you have. Lord knows that if you're on probation and parole and you have been arrested illegally, you have been detained illegally, or your conviction has been obtained illegally, one of the huge problems that parole and probation offenders face is a revocation of those particular issues. So that now your case has been transferred to parole and probation for further review, and whether or not your parole is going to be revoked, or whether or not your probation is going to be terminated, or whether or not you're going to be rearrested. That's another court date. Okay, in addition to the original charge you have, now you're going to have another court date to hear the case dealing with your probation violation. So once a young black man is in the system, and he may have a record, but it doesn't negate the fact that his case, every case, should be looked at with scrutiny, as all cases should, by the public defender's office or by the state's attorney's office who's doing a prosecution. So what you have now is a person who is incarcerated illegally. No one knows that now because no investigation is taking place. And now he's moving through the system based upon an illegal arrest and a bad conviction. Okay. It's quite naturally, he's going to lose a job, because once you are held, that's a no bail particular status 9 times out of 10 when you have probation violations and when you have parole violations. You'll have to sit and wait for your court date. So no employee is going to hold your job for 90 days, 6 months, or whatever it is by the time you go to trial. So that's a problem. And your property, once you've been convicted, your car, your money can be confiscated. That's a huge problem. And so these gun officers in Baltimore City have created huge collateral issues with their undertakings by violating public trust and the public law. Now, there's a case out there called Jose Padilla versus Kentucky, and that dealt with parole. That dealt with deportation, immigration situation, where Mr. Padilla had been a citizen for over 40 years in the United States, and he also had been caught selling marijuana, distribution of marijuana. Okay, when he was found guilty, the public defender who represented him, or his attorney who represented him, never told him what the consequences would be about immigration or deportation situation. And because he was never informed that because he was found guilty, that there loomed over his head a potential possibility that he would be deported. And as such, he agreed to the plea agreement because he didn't know whether he would be deported or not. Basically, essentially, the court came back in that Padilla case and said, well, it's the duty of the public defender or legal counsel at the time to inform their client the potential of a direct consequence or collateral consequence of their pleading guilty. Well, that never happened. So the court ruled in Mr. Padilla's case and reversed the lower court and sent the case back down to the lower court for review. They remained silent on dealing with other direct collateral consequences, and basically has been treated on a case-by-case basis, since Padilla mainly dealt with deportation issues. So the court, again, the U.S. court remained silent on whether or not other collateral consequences that a person was not told about at the time they took a plea could be reviewed at the higher court level. So that's kind of like my understanding of the case. Again, I'm not a law professor. I'm not a lawyer. I've been in criminal justice a long time, though. So I've kind of read cases over and over again. I kind of get the gist of what's going on in a lot of these legal cases. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Okay, now let me tell you some other things, and I think I went over this before, but some of these other things that can happen to a person who's illegally detained, illegally convicted, or conviction is illegally obtained. So, one, with dealing with these legal and regulatory sanctions that state can impose on an individual, I talked about people with criminal records. They become disqualified in many areas of benefits, whether it's welfare benefits, inability to possess firearms, loss of a business, deportation, as I said before, educational benefits, housing, voting, occupational licensing. So if you're a plumber, electrician, or HVAC guy, you stand a reason to lose your license in certain cases that you get found convicted of. And so there's a whole host of immediate consequences and delayed consequences when there's a criminal conviction, an illegal arrest or detention obtained. And so the Gun Squad has set up hundreds of people basically to face some serious direct collateral consequences with their livelihood in their lives. Not only that, see, the consequences go further than just who's happening to that individual. A lot of guys have families and children. A lot of guys have jobs. So, you know, once you illegally arrest somebody, or they're found guilty based upon the illegalities that go on, that person's family is directly affected. It just happens. There's no more money coming in. So, if you look at some of the cases that the gun squad was caught up in, these were legitimate people who had jobs, who had their own businesses, and these people were stealing money from them. And the biggest issue of a collateral consequence is what happens now where the taxpayer gets involved. And let's really look at the consequences of the taxpayer being involved in the wrongdoings of police actions and misconduct. Well, we already know that Baltimore City had to pay out, prior to the Freddie Gray case, over $12 million. I think Mr. Murphy settled that case for $6 million. So let's add the $6 million to the $12 million. So we're at 18, and there's probably a couple more cases that we don't know about that have been settled, just haven't been reported yet. So I'm gonna round it off and say $20 million. That's a lot of money. That has to come from the state of Maryland, and has to come from the city of Baltimore, who's probably going to foot the majority of the bill, because I'm sure Governor Hogan is not going to sit there and want to pay out civil action money or approve civil action money when in fact it's an issue that needs to be dealt with at the city level, when the city level has the problem. And so it gets paid, but quite naturally I'm sure the governor takes issue with that, because that money has to come from somewhere in the budget, and it's coming directly from taxpayers. So let's look at some of the serious issues dealing with the officers and their actions. First and foremost, the officers were accused of stealing well over close to $500,000 in overtime, where they lied about cases, where they kept cases to be postponed. Because if you didn't know, in Baltimore, every time a case is postponed, the officer it gets assigned another court day. And at the same time, he gets another piece of overtime because of that postponement. Whether it's on the state or whether it's on defense, it doesn't matter. He or she still gets paid. So in this case here, these guys aren't even in court the majority of times. They're lying about where they are. They're not in court. They're getting paid. And they're getting paid to the tune of over $500,000. That's a lot of money that the state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore have to recoup. Now, in addition to that, the city now face additional lawsuits for illegal arrest. So let's go back to that $20 million I was talking about. That's money been paid already. So now the state's looking to have to pay out probably close to another $5 million to $10 million in lawsuits stemming from illegal arrest and detention. So this thing is out of control, because it seems like it's no end in sight in terms of who's going to be accountable at the police department for the officers' behavior. This is ridiculous. I'll give you an example. I have a lot of friends of mine, professional friends of mine, who I went to school with, who live in the city, who live in some of the nicer areas of the city where your tax base is a little higher. They always complain about having to pay high city taxes for little resources that they get. Why compound the problem with not being able to keep police officers accountable and the police department to do a much, much better job in what they do? Some of my friends pay somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year in city taxes. They have a right to complain when their money that they pay for services is being abused the way that it's being abused. That's just the politics of it all. I've said what I had to say about that. But when you talk about that, we also talk about officers who had, on average, these officers had about 12 years of service. All of them, all 8 of them, had about 12 years of service. So that's a lot of money that's been paid into their pension. So my question would be to the city, to the state's attorney's office, how are we going to deal with the fact that you have officers who have pensions and who have stolen money, and they still owe the city money, I can't possibly see you giving these officers any pension money back until they settle their bill. That's the first thing. So that needs to be addressed. When and where it just needs to be addressed. Because nobody, no taxpayer, wants to be able to pay somebody's pension, pay a salary to an officer. His pension is accruing. He's stealing $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. There's a problem there, and that needs to be rectified. So when you talk about it, it's just unbelievable. And let's not talk about the court administrative costs. The federal government has to now pay additional money, or the city's going to have to pay additional money to have prosecutors charge these guys, court systems, administrative people. There's a lot of things that are tied up to misconduct and corruption in any state agency. Because, again, we started the whole topic of this whole video off dealing with collateral consequences. And so the average person who might get caught up in the criminal justice system, they have no idea what the magnitude of collateral consequences could possibly be. But it can generally ruin an individual, period, and his family overnight. And so I wanted to bring that up because I thought that it was important, because by and large, the majority of the individuals in the prison system, particularly, and I'm speak solely of Maryland, are African American. Do come from Baltimore. The bulk of the people in the state system are from Baltimore. And so I had to discuss it in its real form. I mean, even when you go back and look at, let's say a person gets found guilty, or a person gets found guilty in circuit court. Generally speaking, the only thing that the judge will ever say to them that is required for a judge to say to someone once they've got convicted are their post-trial rights, which are, judge is going to tell you that you have whatever days to appeal the case. He's going to tell you that you have a 3-judge panel, and he's going to tell you you can file a motion for reconsideration within 90 days of the verdict. So, and the judge, and if a person is on parole or probation, he will also say that, you know, I can't tell you what will happen to you if you're found guilty in this case if you happen to be on parole or probation, which he really can't, because he doesn't know, because that's a separate agency within the criminal justice system that determines what will happen to an individual if they violate their parole or probation. It's not the court. Now, in the case of a probation, it would be the court, because once you go back in front of a judge who issued you that sentence, you know, he or she has the right to give you the balance of that sentence, because that was the contract and you agreed to that when the judge gave you a split sentence or a suspended sentence. That's just part of the deal. Okay? But quite naturally, if you're standing in front of a judge and you didn't commit the crime to trigger a probation violation or a parole violation, it's a little different story. Because now, you know, you have to prove yourself innocent. And in most cases, most people can't prove themselves innocent. They don't have the resources, particularly if your resources were stolen by the police officers who originally locked you up. And so you sit behind bars until cases start to come up and you start to sit there and say, whoa, these officers arrested me, and wow, you know, maybe that happened to me, you know, and you start writing the court system and letting them know, you know, Officer so-and-so, you know, locked me up and put drugs in my, you know, car, or, you know, planted a gun on me, or whatever the case may be. So I just thought I'd bring that up. Now, many of you who have never been involved in the criminal justice system, you may not have any empathy for people who get involved in crime. But it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right that we pay people to wear a badge in this state, to uphold the law, and to do the right thing when it comes to enforcing laws that protect and serve moniker that is generally associated with law enforcement throughout the country, it means a lot on the protect part, but it also means a lot on the serve part. And it is my estimation that the serve part is so important because the serve part relates to having empathy for the people that you serve. And if you can't have empathy for people that you serve, then how can you be an effective servant? You can't go around being apathetic in law enforcement. It's just not going to work. It's been proven that apathetic departments wither and die because they lose their sense of purpose. And when you have ethical violations, you are losing your sense of purpose as an organization. And so I just thought I'd bring that up. I'm going to stop the video at this time, but I just want to talk about what can happen and what's going to happen and what has happened already to hundreds of people right now who were incarcerated by the gun squad, who had their property taken, who had their property, if not already, in some cases, sold. In some cases, families have been separated. Trust me, I talk to people all the time, and I know what I'm talking about. That once a person goes to jail or to prison for whatever time period, it is such a stressful period for the families. It's unbelievable, unbelievable, particularly when children are involved. You see, because it's a big. I told you earlier in the video, it's a bigger issue, much bigger issue than what's directly happening to that individual. This thing has consequences far beyond that arrest. That if you don't really sit down and look at it, you would never know. And this is why we put the video together here at Advanced Criminology, just so you could know what's going on and some of the things that will be happening. Okay, so I'm going to finish this at the 32 mark. Thank you. Stay tuned for other videos dealing with the Baltimore City Police Department and some of the other law enforcement issues around the country.